Richard Langston's hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel of his Bentley, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at Oakwood Cemetery. 3 years. 3 years since he'd buried his 8-year-old son Michael here, and still, every visit felt like swallowing glass. The security guard at the gates nodded respectfully as Richard drove through. Even in his grief, people recognized the tech mogul who'd built an empire from nothing. But today, none of that mattered. Today was Michael's birthday. Richard parked near the familiar headstone and stepped into the drizzle, his expensive shoes squelching in the muddy grass. As he rounded the corner toward Michael's grave, he stopped cold. A small figure knelt beside the marble headstone. A boy, maybe 7 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. In his dirt-stained hands, he held something that made Richard's breath catch. Michael's red toy fire truck, the one they'd buried with him. "Hey!" Richard's voice cracked like a whip across the cemetery. "What are you doing?" The boy scrambled backward, clutching the truck to his chest. His eyes were wide with terror, but he didn't run. Instead, he did something that stunned Richard into silence. "I'm sorry, mister," the boy whispered. "I wasn't stealing it. I was telling him about my day." Richard's anger evaporated, replaced by confusion. "Telling who about your day?" "Michael." The boy's voice was barely audible. "I come here sometimes. When things get bad at home, I sit with him and pretend he's my friend." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered closer, studying the child's face. Hollow cheeks, bruises fading yellow on his arms, shoes held together with duct tape. This wasn't some vandal or grave robber. This was a child who understood loneliness. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice gentler now. "Joshua." The boy hugged the fire truck tighter. "Are you gonna call the police?" "No." Richard sank onto the wet grass beside his son's grave, his $1,000 suit forgotten. "How did you get Michael's truck?" Joshua's face crumpled. "It was sticking out of the ground after that big storm last month. I thought maybe someone threw it away. I didn't know it belonged to someone who—" He gestured helplessly at the headstone. Richard closed his eyes. The storm, of course. It had been violent enough to shift the earth around the cemetery. He'd been traveling for business, hadn't visited since. "Tell me about these conversations you have with Michael," Richard said quietly. Joshua looked uncertain, then began to speak in a rush. "I tell him about school when I get to go. About my mom. She's sick a lot and sometimes she can't get out of bed for days. I tell him about Tyler and Benjamin, the boys who pick on me, 'cause my clothes are old. And about Ashley from my class. She's really nice, but I'm too scared to talk to her." As Joshua spoke, Richard felt something crack open inside his chest. This boy's problems were so different from his own, yet the loneliness was identical. The need for connection, for someone who would listen without judgment. "Where's your father?" Richard asked. "Gone." Joshua's voice was matter-of-fact. "Mom says he left when I was little. She works 2 jobs when she's feeling okay, but lately—" He trailed off, then looked directly at Richard. What was Michael like? The question caught Richard off guard. For 3 years, people had tiptoed around his grief, offering empty condolences but never asking about his son as a person. This 7-year-old stranger was the first to simply ask. "He loved fire trucks," Richard said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "He wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up. Said he was going to save everyone in the whole world." Joshua smiled for the first time. "He sounds brave." He was. Richard's throat tightened. He was sick for a long time before, but he never complained. Always worried about making me and his mother feel better. "Where's his mom now?" "We divorced after Michael died." Richard's voice was flat. "Grief does strange things to people. We blamed each other, blamed ourselves. Olivia, that was her name, she moved to California. We don't talk anymore." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 broken people sharing space with a memory. Finally, Richard stood. "Joshua, I want you to keep the truck." The boy's eyes went wide. "Really?" Michael would have liked that. He always shared his toys. Richard pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card. "But I want you to do something for me. I want you to come work for me." "Work?" Joshua looked confused. "I'm only 7. Richard almost smiled. "Not that kind of work. I want you to visit Michael once a week and tell him about your life. In exchange, I'll make sure you have what you need. Clothes, food, help for your mother." "Why would you do that?" The question was so simple, so honest, that it took Richard a moment to find the answer. "Because sitting here with you today, I felt closer to my son than I have in 3 years. And because Michael would have wanted me to help." Over the following months, Richard kept his promise. He quietly paid for Joshua's mother Lauren to see specialists, funded her treatment, and ensured Joshua had everything he needed for school. But more than that, he looked forward to their weekly meetings at the cemetery. Through Joshua's eyes, Richard began to see his son differently. Not just as the child he'd lost, but as the boy who would have grown up making friends with lonely kids, who would have shared his toys without hesitation. "Mr. Richard," Joshua said one afternoon, 6 months after their first meeting, "I think Michael would be proud of you." "Why's that?" "'Cause you're saving people now, like he wanted to do." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. "I'm not saving anyone, Joshua. You saved me," the boy said simply. "And Tyler stopped picking on me after you talked to his parents. And Benjamin wants to be friends now that I have nice clothes. And Ashley," Joshua blushed. "She asked me to sit with her at lunch." That evening, Richard did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He called Olivia. "Richard." Her voice was cautious, surprised. "I met someone I think you should know about," he said. "A little boy who talks to Michael." The story he told her brought them both to tears. For the first time since their son's death, they talked about Michael not with pain, but with love. About his generosity, his bravery, his infectious laugh. "I've been seeing a therapist," Olivia admitted. "Learning to live with the grief instead of fighting it." "Maybe," Richard hesitated, "maybe we could both visit Michael together sometime. With Joshua." A year later, Richard stood at Michael's grave again, but this time he wasn't alone. Joshua was there, now 8 and thriving in school. Lauren stood nearby, healthy and smiling, her medical bills a distant memory. And beside Richard stood Olivia, their hands intertwined for the first time in 4 years. They weren't the same people who had been destroyed by grief. They were something new, a family rebuilt not on the foundation of their loss, but on the love they still carried for the boy who had brought them all together. "Tell Michael about your week," Richard said to Joshua as he did every visit. As the boy began to speak, Richard realized the truth that had taken him so long to understand. Michael hadn't left them. He lived on in every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every hand extended to someone in need. The fire truck sat permanently on Michael's headstone now, a bridge between the boy who was gone and the boy who had found his way to hope. And in the space between grief and healing, a new kind of love had grown, one that honored the past while embracing the future. Sometimes the most profound miracles happen in the quietest moments, in conversations with the dead that bring the living back to life. And sometimes, a lonely billionaire and a forgotten boy can save each other, one story at a time. Grace, Richard learned, wasn't something you earned or deserved. It was something that found you when you were brave enough to sit in the mud beside a stranger and share your pain. And in that sharing, everything broken could begin to heal.